Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf Kuf Yud. My apologies for running a few minutes late. We are near the bottom of Kuf Tet Amud Bet. We are at the last word on the second to last line. But let's back up a little bit to remind ourselves of the question that we're currently facing. We had in our Mishnah the statement by Rabbi Lazar that, in fact, let's go back and find that statement. Rabbi Lazar said, Rabbi Lazar poter ad yakriv es kulan. When it came to the kometz, the lavona, the ketores, the minchas kohanim, the minchas kohan Mashiach, the minchas nesachim, all of those that are brought, if they're brought outside of the Beis Hamikdash, they need to be brought in the full amount. A kezias is not enough for one to be liable for bringing them as offerings outside the Beis Hamikdash. But at the same time, Rav said that Rebbe Lazar agrees with the following brisa. Chatzi pras bifnim patur. That if you offer a half a pras of the ketoris inside. Now, what exactly that meant is part of the answer, but we understand it to be referring to the same thing as our Mishnah, and that suggests that offering, and you are supposed to offer a full pras, and yet you offered half a pras, and yet we said you're exempt. The community is exempt from offering it again, and it would seem, at least again, the presumption of the question, which seems to be accepted even in the answer, is that Rebbe Lazar, just as he requires you to offer the full amount in order to be liable if you bring it outside the Beis Hamikdash, similarly, he would require the full amount for you to be successful in bringing it inside the Beis Hamikdash. And yet here we seem to say Chatzi pras bifnim patur. So that was the question. We offered an answer from Rabbah, which we rejected. We offered an answer from Abaye, the answer from Rabbah was the fact that that we're talking about two different ketores situations. One is the ketores in the Kodesh HaKodashim on Yom Kippur, and that is where, according to Rebbe Lazar, even if you don't take two full handfuls, you'll still be successful. And the rabbis say, no, you need two full handfuls. And so Rabbi Lazar would say, just as inside the Beis Hamikdash you don't need two full handfuls, so too outside the Beis Hamikdash you don't need two full handfuls in order to violate. So that would
So didn't he
be
say that? Didn't, if I heard you correctly, that Rob was saying inside the Beit HaMikdash, if it was Chatzi Pras, he's Patur, right?
he's patur, meaning that that was refined. The brisa was refined to explain that what it's referring to. It means that the community has fulfilled its obligation.
Right. So then he would not be Chayav, and we're trying to find Rabbi
No, no, no,
Eliezer
no,
by saying
no,
that
no.
he's
Wait, wait, wait,
Chayav.
wait. You're going in the wrong direction.
That's
We're
what I'm not
talking.
understanding. That's what
I
I
know
was.
that's why I'm trying to stop you so that you don't go into the wrong direction too far and get yourself confused more. So the point is that the what we're saying is that on Yom Kippur, if the Kohen Gadol, according to Rabbi Lazar, according to Rabbah's answer for the question that Reb Zera asked, that according to Rebbe Lazar, if you were to offer less than two handfuls, you would actually fulfill the obligation. You would not need to go back into the Kodesh HaKodashim in order to offer that incense offering a second time. That's what we're saying, and that helps us understand why, when it came to Chatzi Pras Bifnim Patur, that Rav could say that even Rebbe Lazar agrees with that. The problem with that answer that Abaye pointed out is that the Chumash says that the two Melechov Nav, the two handfuls, is a chok, And as a result, it clearly must be that everybody says that you need two full handfuls. And so Abaye modifies Rabba's answer and says that the disagreement is only about offering outside. And so as a result, the disagreement is the following. According to Rabbi Lazar, you would say that even though ordinarily you might say that you need two full handfuls in order to fulfill in order to violate the commandment not to offer sacrifices outside the Beis Hamikdash. Here, because we learn from the regular Ketores to the inner Ketores, just like the regular Ketores, all you need is an olive size. So too, if you were to bring the inner Ketores, the Ketores for Yom Kippur, outside the Beis Hamikdash, all you need is an olive size. And so the point is that and so Rebbe Lazar says, excuse me, that we don't derive the inner from the outer, and therefore you would need the full amount, whereas the rabbis say you do, and therefore you don't need the full amount. Whereas we talk about being a half a pras inside being exempt, we're talking about the daily offering, the daily ketores. And so as a result, when it comes to the daily ketores, Rabbi Lazar would agree with the rabbis that even half a pras inside is going to fulfill the obligation. And the disagreement when we had in our Mishnah that it said that according to Rabbi Lazar you need the full amount, that's talking about on Yom Kippur, and we're talking about the Ketores that was brought inside the Kodesh HaKodashim. And so as a result, if you were to bring that Ketores outside, you would, according to Rabbi Lazar, you would need the full amount, even though the rabbis say, no, we'll learn about that the rabbis say, no, we don't need the full amount, even an olive's volume is sufficient to cause a problem, because we'll learn about the Ketores on Yom Kippur from the Ketores of the rest of the year. And Rava challenged that, noting the fact that in fact we don't generally learn from one offering inside to another. And he cites a brisa that shows that we don't learn about the Lugin, offering the Lugin outside the Beis Hamikdash from offering other things outside the Beis Hamikdash that are supposed to also go on the outer altar. And so as a result, he phrases it as we don't learn one thing that goes on the outer altar from another thing that goes on the outer altar. How are we supposed to learn something that's supposed to go in the inner sanctum, in the Kodesh HaKodashim, from something that goes elsewhere, goes out on the altar in the Kodesh? So just as we don't learn one from the other with respect to the outer altar, we're not going to learn one from the other with respect to the two different kinds of ketores. So as a result, now Rava answers his answer. Again, the question is, how come Rabbi Lazar says in one place you need the full amount, and in another place Rav says that he agrees that even a partial amount is sufficient? So Ella Amar Rava,
right? Are we using patur and chayev in different senses?
no, in totally different senses. Patur, in this sense, is not talking about somebody who's liable for offering a korban outside the Beis Hamikdash, but rather somebody who's the community's obligation to repeat a sacrifice. So it's you're patur from the obligation of repeating the sacrifice. That's the way we're understanding the brisa. And so the implication of that is that the two issues are connected. If you say that a partial amount is sufficient to fulfill your obligation, you should say that a partial amount is sufficient to violate the prohibition. And that's the question, because it seems like it's very clear from our Mishnah that Rebbe Lazar says that you need the full
Oh.
amount to violate. So therefore, he should also need the full amount to fulfill. And so that's the question. So
So you want to
Elam.
use it almost in an opposite sense. In one case, the patu refers that it's sufficient amount. In the other, okay, a chatzi pras would cause a violation.
Correct. Correct. That's what it make that's what makes that brisa so confusing. You're absolutely right. What makes the brisa so confusing is that effectively we're using putter in a completely different sense. So Ella Amarava kagon de kaviinu shnei chatzayim pras. What happens is, let's keep going. Kuf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph Bimana in a that what happens is you took, even though you only need a kazayas amount, what you did is you took two half a pras amounts, you put them into a single vessel for the ketores, and now you've sanctified it. So Mar Savar Kvius Mana Milsahi. So Rebbe Lazar says that kind of designation makes a difference. And as a result, if you were to burn that incense outside, you would only be liable if you burned the entire amount. And Umar Savar and the rabbi say, Lav Milsahi. It's not. That's not what matters. What matters is what you're legally required. And even though you put more than necessary into a mana, into a vessel altogether, it's not going to change what will be sufficient. So, but when it comes to an ordinary case of incense, so then Rabbi Lazar would agree with the Chachamim that when it comes to ordinary incense, even a kazayas is sufficient, even though we do set an amount that you're supposed to do of a pras when it comes to the daily ketoris offering. So Amarava.
So is he making the distinction here also between Yom Kippur and Chol?
Yes, we're making two distinctions. Absolutely. He's still making the distinction between Yom Kippur and Chol. He is saying that everything is talking about Chol. He's sort of saying, unlike the other people who made our Mishnah about Yom Kippur and the Brisa about Chol, he is saying that no, the Mishnah and the Brisa are both talking about Chol, but we're now talking about in one situation you've combined the things. That's our Mishnah, and in one situation you have not combined things, and so that's the Brisa. So in the Brisa, even one kazayas is going to be sufficient, even a half a pras is going to be sufficient, but to fulfill the communal's obligation. But when it comes to the violation outside the Beis Hamikdash and the disagreement between Rebbe Lazar and the Chachamim, that's according to Rava, that's going to be a situation where you combine more than necessary amount in a single vessel, and according to Rebbe Lazar, that matters, and therefore, if you don't bring the whole thing outside the Beis Hamikdash, you're not violating the prohibition of offering outside the Beis Hamikdash. And according to the Chachamim, no, it doesn't matter that you put it all in one container. Even if you do one olive's amount, that's the amount that's necessary, and therefore you're going to have violated the obligation. So Amar Rava gives a further ramification of this ruling. Hashta lamanda Amar kaviyusa demana below klumhu, according to the rabbis who say that combining things in one vessel, it doesn't matter. Keva shisha lapar. Let's say you took 6 lug of wine for a bull. Umashak mehen arba be'krivan b'chutz. And then you only offered 4, which is all that you really need to offer, outside the Beis Hamikdash. Chayav, you would still be liable. Sharuyan la'ayil. If you take the 4, if you take the 4 that you need for that goes with a ram, and keva arba la'ayil, and you put 4 in the lug, umashak mehen shlosha ve'krivim b'chutz, and then you offer 3 of them outside, chayav, you would still be chayav, sheru'uyin lekeves. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. My apologies. Let's back up. So keva shisha lepar umashak mehen arba ve'kriven b'chutz chayav shiruyin la'ayil. That when you if you had set aside six and then you gave four outside the Beis Hamikdash, even though they were all in one vessel, because four is sufficient for a ram, that shows you're still going to be liable. And if you set aside four for a ram in a vessel, umashach mehen shlosha ve'krivan b'chutz, and then you offer only three outside, then even though you had set aside for the ram, chayav sheru'uyin lekeves, because that three is all you need for a lamb. Chasru kol shehu ve'kriva b'chutz. But if you have less than three and you offer it outside, patur, then you would be exempt because you did not offer the minimum shear sufficient. As Rashi says, patur. Third line in the narrow lines of Rashi on Kuf Yud Amud Aleph, de batzir mishloshes lugin lo chazu b'fnim. We never see any time that in the Beis Hamikdash that less than three lug of wine is going to be sufficient, and so as a result, you would not have violated the prohibition of making the offering outside. So now we go.
So is that quantity chatzi pras?
A chatzi pras is a solid volume as opposed to a lug, which is a wet volume. A chatzi
Okay, but
pras.
the other one, when we talked about shlosha and arba before, that we're talking about a chatzi pras, right?
No, no, this is all lugin. This is when
So,
Rabba made his statement, he was talking about lugin, which is a liquid volume, a cheek. Yeah, I think a cheekful essentially. Um,
but there's
so
still we can consider as a pras, right? Or not? Because
no, no, this is now we're talking about wine. Pras was a solid volume in connection with the Ketores.
but pras by itself, the word means portion. So if there's
No, it often is used to associate with a loaf of a piece
right,
of bread.
but
So
it could but in general terms it's a portion. So if we have where a chayiv a pras shalem or a chatzi pras, it's whatever the portion is for that entity
yeah, no, in this context, it's being used as a measurement of volume, and so
of a
of solid
solid
volume,
volume.
a
Okay.
solid volume, exactly. Okay, so now we go back, and as I mentioned yesterday, Rav Ashi comes to the rescue of Abaye and says, "You know what, Rava, your question on Abaye is not a great question." Rav Ashi Amar, and take a look at Rashi, one, two, three, four lines down. L'olam k'detirtza Abaye. Really, we can follow Abaye's answer. D'b'haktara shel pnim b'chutz. That what we're talking about is in the Mishnah is where you have the ketores that is supposed to go into the Kodesh HaKodashim on Yom Kippur, and you are offering it outside. Pligi. That's the argument. Ubemelef panim michutz. And we're arguing about whether we learn from the inner to the outer, meaning that from what is the law with respect to the regular ketores to the other ketores. Udikakashyalach hashta chutz michutz lo yalfi rabbanan. So, and that which you asked about the fact that how could we learn the inner from the outer when we don't even learn the outer from the outer, lo dummy nisuch lehaktara. The nisuch of the shlosha lugin, which we didn't learn from the ketores, where we didn't say just like ketores, a kazayas is sufficient. We're going to say a kazayas is sufficient for the wine. The nisuch mehaktara lo yalfi rabbanan, because the rabbis don't learn the laws associated with the incense from the laws associated with the incense to the laws associated with the wine. But afal gaf de chutz michutz, even though those two have something that's similar to each other in that they're both outside. Aval ketores shel pnim, but when it comes to the ketores of Yom Kippur, miketores shel heichal, we can learn it from the ketores of the kodesh, that daily ketoris. Yalfi, we can learn the alpha gap depenim nichutz, even though you're learning about the inner, namely the Yom Kippur laws from the outer, from the laws of the ketoris associated with the daily ketoris. So now that we know exactly what the Gemara is going to say, let's go back into the Gemara and let's take a look at Rav Ashi's statement. So
Now you just mentioned a kazayat, but if aren't we saying that solids are different than liquids? Do you use the same term kazayat
Kezias
to a
is
lugin?
Kezias is one of the few things that actually applies both for a liquid and for solids. So again, so Rav Ashi Amar, Rav Ashi says we are one. So here we go. I lost my place. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, 8 lines down. Third word on the line. Rav Ashi Amar Nisach Makatorah Lo Yalfei Rabbanan. When it comes to Nisuch, the halacha associated with the wine that needs the volume of wine that needs to be poured outside the Beis Hamikdash in order to be liable for bringing something outside the Beis Hamikdash, we're not going to learn that from Haktarah, from something that is burned. Afal gaf dechutz michutz, even though it's one outer thing to another outer thing. And the Shita Mikubetzes here takes out the words lo yalfi. And we continue, hakatara me'akatara yalfi. But we will learn one burning thing from another burning thing, namely the incense. One incense from another. Afal gaf difnim michutz. Even though we're, and this again, the hay changes it. It should be pnim michutz, not chutz mipnim. And so as a result, we are going to learn from the outer to the inner. And so as a result, we're going to say that you're going to be liable, even though you only did a small amount according to the rabbis. Whereas Rebbe Lazar would say, no, you need the full amount because he does not learn the outer, he does not learn the inner from the outer in that case in connection with the incense. And so now we've successfully answered the question, even according to Abaye. Okay, so we don't, and it's interesting that the Gemara sort of leaves it that way. Gemara does not actually then say, okay, so now we've got two answers. Which of those answers is correct? In general, we paskin like Rava over Abaye. Okay, B'chulun shechasru,
But
and
are we
so
applying now the ketoret? Are we learning from the ketoret to what? To what else? To the lugim?
So we're learning from the Ketoret of the everyday, where the Ketoret of every day, one Kazayas is sufficient. And so we're going to learn, according to the Chachamim, according to Abaye, we're going to learn from that to the Ketores of Yom Kippur if you bring it outside the Beis Hamikdash. And although you need 2 full handfuls, according to everybody, in order to fulfill your obligation inside the Beis Hamikdash, inside the Kodesh HaKodeshim, if you're bringing it up outside the Beis Hamikdash, we're going to say that you're going to be liable even if you bring just one kazayas. And Rebbe Lazar in our Mishnah is going to say, no, that's not sufficient. And when we have this brisa that says that even half a pras is sufficient, that is referring to the daily ketoris, not the Yom Kippur ketoris, and therefore Rebbe Lazar does agree that when it comes to the daily ketoris, even a smaller amount will be sufficient as long as you have a kazayas. Okay.
So, but what's the pras here? Kazayat or chetzi kazayat?
A pras is larger than a kazayas. And a chatzi pras is also larger than a kazayas. And what we said yesterday, there's a Rashi that specifically notes that that in fact the pras is lav. That when we say chatzi pras, it's lav dafka. It's the first Rashi on the Gemara near the bottom of Kuf Tet Amabet. If you take a look, narrow, second to last narrow line, Rashi says chatzi pras bifnim, lav dafka chatzi pras. Doesn't mean to be specifically a half a pras. Naka. Dehu adin lekazayas, as long as it's a kazayas, it's going to be sufficient. Ela pachos mikishir hakosher hakasher mitzvasa naka. But the point is that we're choosing an amount that is less than the full amount that ordinarily we think is required. Ordinarily, when it comes to the Ketoris on a daily basis, you're supposed to use a full pras, and here the person used something less than that, but at least they used the kazayas, and everybody agrees that that's going to be sufficient.
But what is the required amount here? Is it a beitza? Is it a pra? Is it kazayas?
According to the way
A
Rashi
pras, a
understands the
full
Gemara,
pras. What would it be?
a full pras is what's necessary,
But what
and
is that? What
that
is the
is
shear?
I don't remember exactly. I don't have my. I keep a cheat sheet next to my computer on my office, but I don't have it with me. I'm on the road, so I don't have the exact amount. But I can get that for you. But the bottom line is that it's multiple eggs in volume. This is much larger
Kazayas. It's more than
than a
kazayas.
kazayas.
It's more, and
Exactly.
more, maybe more than a beitza.
Yeah, it's much more than even a beta. Correct.
Uh-huh.
All right. The chul and shechasra. So now we said, according to everybody, if any of them were reduced slightly, if you reduce the amount that was going to be offered, you were going to be exempt. And we said even this is according to Rashi. According to Rashi explained that even according to Rebbe Lazar would agree that if you reduce the amounts so that less than an olive volume is left over, and now you take it outside and you offer that less than olive volume outside the base Hamikdash, you're not going to be liable. So ibailahu chisaron dechutz shmei chisaron olo shmei chisaron. Now, what we've been talking about in the Mishnah was where you offered, let's say you're supposed to offer 3 lug, and then you offered 3 lug minus a kazayas, minus a little bit. So you offered just over 3 lug minus a kazayas. And now you took it outside in the temple. And then you took the last little bit, the kazayas minus a little bit outside. So that's where our Mishnah said that you're not going to be liable. But what if you took a full kazayas outside the Beis Hamikdash, and now that kazayas a little bit spilled, and so now you're offering. What's the story in that situation? So as Rashi says, Chasar and Dekutz, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi on Kuf Yud Amud Aleph. Hotzian Shlemim, you took out the full amount. And thank you so much for sharing the link to the measurement. So Ken, you can take a look at that in your free time in the chat. So if you take a full amount outside the chasru leibud, and then some of it got lost. So what happens in that situation? Do we say shmei chasaram v'im ha'Allah as hamishuyar b'chutz patur, that it's less than the full amount, and so therefore you're liable? Or do we say no, or do we say that it is not considered a full amount, and therefore, because it's still less than a kazayas, and so as a result, you're not liable? So miamrinan kevan denafik ipasulahu. That do we say that since when it left, it became invalidated as soon as it left? Mali chaser, mali yeser. Who cares whether it's extra or not, whether you have the right amount or not? Because as soon as it left, it became pasul, and your action did that, and now you're offering whatever you have. So we should say, no, it's going to be problematic, and you're going to be liable. Odilma yotze de ise beine in. No, you need the invalidation to go out completely, and you need what you're doing on the outer altar to be a complete element. Delasi be'ene lo, and if it's not a complete thing, then you're not going to be liable. So 2 efforts, neither of them are going to be successful, and so as a result, we will not answer the question of what happens if you bring out a kazayas and then some of it goes away. So Amar Abaye Tashma Rabbi Elazar Poter Achi Yakriv Es Kulan. Rabbi Elazar said in our Mishnah that he has to bring all of it. So Amar Lay, and that implies so that if you offer all of it, then it's got to all still be in existence. So doesn't that show that the rabbis don't disagree with that element of Rebbe Lazar, and so as a result, it must be that it all has to be in existence, and if any of it fell while you were outside, you're not going to be liable. So Amrle Rabba Bar of Chanan ala Abaye mid Rabbi Elazar Pashit Mar. 1 second. We're talking about the halakha associated with the rabbis, not Rebbe Lazar. So how can you use Rebbe Lazar to try and answer what the rabbis would say? So Amar Le, Rabbi explained back, Beferish Shmieli Mine de Rav. Well, I heard explicitly from Rav, Ad Kan Lo Pligi Rabbanan Ale de Rebbe Lazar, Ela de Isi Beine. No, that's the point that I'm saying, that the rabbis only argued with Rebbe Lazar in a situation because they're talking about a situation where the whole thing exists. But if there was anything missing, they would admit. And wasn't that statement that Rav was talking about, that the rabbis would agree with Rabbi Lazar, talking about a situation where it fell outside the Beis Hamikdash? No, not necessarily. Lo dechaser bifnim. Maybe it got diminished inside the Beis Hamikdash, and so as a result, in that situation where you're bringing out whatever you have and you're offering it as a sacrifice outside the Beis Hamikdash, you'll be liable, and the rabbis would agree. And even if some were to then be diminished outside the Beis Hamikdash, they would still agree that you'd be liable because you left with enough. So we have not proven the case in either direction. So Tashma, our second effort to prove it, the kulan shechasru, the hekriven b'chutz pater. Again, the language of our Mishnah says that if any of these were reduced and they were brought outside, you would not be liable. Lav dechaser b'chutz. Isn't this talking about where it became less than the full amount outside the Beis Hamikdash? Again, the same answer. Lo dechaser b'fnim. It could be where it got diminished inside the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so in the end, we don't have an answer to that question. The last little bit.
What's the nafkamina here? If a person has to, in order to be chayav, he has to bring a certain amount on the mizbeach outside, whatever that amount is. We're not sure. It's last half, the more. But if it doesn't get there, it's not enough to make someone
the question that's being asked is what maybe it matters why it doesn't get there. You're absolutely right that one understanding of this is that could be that it doesn't matter how come it all didn't make it there. If it all doesn't make it there, you're not going to be liable.
Right.
But another approach says if in fact you brought out the rest of whatever it is that you had from the Beis Hamikdash, and now only outside the Beis Hamikdash you have a little bit of spillage, and now you bring up whatever you have left, maybe because when you brought it out you had the full amount and you put everything you had on the altar, we're still going to make you liable. But you're right that there are two different approaches, and in the end, the Gemara doesn't choose one of these two different approaches.
So you're saying if there was the leftover, you brought that later as an addition. You found it, whatever fell down, you picked it up and put it.
No.
You
brought again. You were dealing with leftover pieces of sacrifices that were offered in the Beis Hamikdash. So, for example, you have the 3 lug of wine that goes along with a sheep, and now you poured 2.5 of them out, and now you take the half lug that's left and you go and you bring it outside the Beis Hamikdash and you put it on a mizbeach outside the Beis Hamikdash. And now the question is, but just before you put it on that mizbeach, a little bit spilled out. So you didn't pour a full half. You poured 2/5 of it, 40% of it, 40% of a lug. Well, now the question is, Well, when you took it out of the Beis Hamikdash, it was enough that you, if you poured it all on this altar outside, you would be liable. So do we say that since when you took it out, it was enough to make you liable? Now that you were bad with it and you poured some out, which you should weren't intending to do, but you poured some out, and now you put it on the thing, so you should still be liable. That's one approach. And the other approach is no. The bottom line is that the total amount needed to be 3 lug. You didn't do a total amount of 3 lug. You didn't do 2.5 inside and a half outside. You did 2.5 inside, and you did 40% outside. That's 2.9. That's not 3. So as a result, that approach would say you're not liable. So those are the two different approaches, and the Gemara doesn't choose between the two.
It would seem to be most logical that if it didn't make it there, whatever, I mean, well, you have to bring 6 pounds of butter to make the bread, and you don't have 6 pounds, it's not a good bread. I mean, whatever it might be. I mean, I
I
didn't.
I understand that approach, but the bottom line is that the Gemara twice tries to support that approach. But both times the Gemara responds, no, it's not a definitive proof. So you may very well be right that that's how we conclude, but the bottom line is that the Gemara couldn't prove it.
Mhm.
Okay, so now Hamakriv Kachim. So we said the last little bit of our Mishnah said that if you sanctify, let me find the last little bit. So Hamakriv Kachim, the Emurim B'chutz, if you offer the meat of sacrificial animals along with their sacrificial parts outside, you're going to be liable. So Amai, why should you be liable? V'ha'ika chatzitza. If you take a look, the meat is going to be underneath. The fat that is usually on top. And so as a result, there's a separation between the altar and the fat of the emurin, which is what is making you liable, because just burning the meat that could be edible, that was edible from the sacrifice on an outer altar, is not going to make you liable because you're not supposed to burn the meat. And so as a result, because we're not talking about an ola, we're talking about a shlamim, for example, or any other sacrifice that part of it gets eaten. And we're talking about taking the eating part and some of the burning part, and you put it on the outer altar. And we're saying that you're going to be liable for that. That's what our Mishnah said. But why would you be liable? There's going to be a chatzitza, as Rashi tells us, va'ika chatzitza. This is basically just before the middle of the narrow lines of Rashi. Shahabasar Eino roi lahaktara, right? The meat itself is not fit for burning. So chotzetz, it separates bein emurim lema'aracha, it's between the burnt part, the parts that are supposed to be burned, and the fire burning on the altar. The dukavase depinim lav ha'alahi. And you're not doing an offering like what needs to be done in the Beis Hamikdash. The Rachmana Amar al ha'etzim. The Torah says that you need to do it the way you need to put the burned parts on the wood. Asher al ha'esh, that is on the fire. The kasalka daitach the masnisin Rabbi Yossi. And we're right now assuming that our Mishnah is like Rabbi Yossi. The Amar einu chayev ad sheyala l'rosh hamizbech kakatores panim, that you have to put the sacrifice on the top of the altar, just like the katoris needs to be burned in the Kodesh. And so as a result, that's the question. And the answer is Amar Shmuel. So we're going to give three different answers. Amar Shmuel, Kishahavachan. He flipped it over, and so as a result, he made sure that the emurim was actually touching the altar. Answer number two, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Afilu Tema Shelo Havachan. You don't have to say that he turned it over. V'hamani Rabbi Shimon he. This is according to Rabbi Shimon. The Amar Afilu Hela Al Sela Chayav. It doesn't make a difference how you offer it up. Even if you don't offer it up exactly the same way that you offer it in the Beis Hamikdash, you offer it on a rock, for example, then you're going to be liable. Whereas again, Rabbi Yossi HaGlili said, and as we assumed in the question, that you need to offer it just like you offered it up in the Beis Hamikdash, which is why he says that you need to use an altar. And answer number three, Rav Amar min bimino eino chotzitz. Nah, you know what? It could be according to anybody. And you know what? When you have two things that are connected, that doesn't constitute a chatzitza. And so as a result, even though you're right that the meat is below the emurim, and therefore the emurim are not directly touching the fire, but that doesn't constitute a separation. And so as a result, we're going to treat it as if the fire is directly touching the emurim. Okay, so we have those three answers, and we're up to the next Mishnah.
And we talked
Mincha,
about a rock, but
yes.
is that a bama like outside the Beit Hamikdash? I mean, we talked
Well,
about that
that's the
before.
machlokas that we saw a few days ago. According to Rabbi Shimon, because a rock could be used as a bama outside the Beis
Right,
Hamikdash,
right,
therefore a rock is sufficient. Whereas Rabbi Yossi Aglili said, no, a rock is not sufficient for a bama. And the story of Shimshon, where his
right,
father Manoach puts the sacrifice on a rock, that was an exception. That was a harasha, and so
right.
as a result, so that you're absolutely right. That's the question. This relates exactly to that question. So mincha shalo nikmitza v'hikriva b'chutz. If you have a mincha that, and now what do you do with the mincha? You use your hand. You stick your hand into the flour and you do a kamitza. You take a fistful that you use your pinky to get the extra stuff out of the one end. You take your thumb to get the extra stuff out of the other end. And what's left inside, that's the kamitza. That's going to go in a kli sharis and then be put on the mizbeach. But you didn't yet do the kamitza. Mincha shalo nikmitza v'hikriva b'chutz. So instead you have the whole vessel with all of the flour in it. Patur. Then you're going to be exempt. You haven't violated the prohibition about bringing stuff outside the Beis Hamikdash because you haven't done an essential element of the service. Kamsa v'chazar v'komsa l'tocha. If you did the kamitza and then the kamitza fell back into the container, the kriva b'chutz, and then you brought it out, chayav, then you'd be liable because inside that container is the kamitza that you set aside, and now you've burnt that kamitza not on the mizbeach as you're supposed to, but on the outer altar, on some foreign altar, and therefore you're going to be liable. But va'amai, why are you going to be liable? Levitle shirayim lekomitz. There's so much more leftover flour compared to the komitz. The komitz isn't a very large amount, and so as a result, you should be able to nullify the komitz relative to everything else, and it should be just like before you did the kamitza. So, and just as before you did the kamitza, you would not be liable. So too after the kamitza, and it falls back in, you should not be liable. So Rabbi Zera nemar haktara bekomitz v'nemra haktara b'shirayim. You know what? The Torah tells us, uses the word haktara both with respect to the komitz and with respect to the leftover flour. Now, with respect to the leftover flour, technically the Torah tells us don't burn it, right? That it's important to note that fact. It says, Kikol seor b'chol dvash lo taktiru mimenu ishel Hashem. We learn from the mimenu that is also, even though the literal translation is it's talking about don't add leavening or honey to regular sacrifices. We're going to learn from it. Because it says mimenu, the Gemara elsewhere learns from it that in fact there's a prohibition of burning the leftover mincha flour after you take the kamitza. And so as a result, even though one of those burning references is a prohibition, it says burning by both, and so therefore mahak tares kometz ein kometz mevatel, just as when you have two different kamitzas. Let's say you have two different kamitzas and they get accidentally put into the same kli shares. Because they have to be put into a kli shares before they get burned. But let's say they get put into the same kli shares. And now people have different sized hands. One person's hand is going to be larger than the other person's. And so as a result, maybe you would say that one kamitza would be mevatel the other kamitza, and only one of them would have fulfilled their obligation. But we don't say that. And so as a result, just as we don't say that with respect to the kamitza, af haktara shirayim ein shirayim mevatlin kat kometz. Similarly, we learn based on the Gzeira Shava of haktara to haktara, we're going to say that the same rule applies to a mincha a kometz that falls into the shirayim, that the kometz is still going to be able to be burned. And therefore, if you were to bring it outside the base of Mikdash and offer it as a sacrifice, it would be a problem. All right. Hakometz, next Mishnah, Hakometz v'halavona shehikriv es echad mehen b'chutz. If you have, now, when you do a mincha offering, you need both the kometz and the lavona. Now, what happens if you only offer one of them? So, Chayav, the Tanakhama, the rabbis say that you're going to be liable. Rabbi Lazar poter achi yakriv v'sasheni. No, Rabbi Lazar says no, you're not going to be liable until you offer both, because consistent with Rabbi Lazar's position generally, you have to offer the full thing. Echa b'fnim ve'echa b'chutz. However, if you offer one inside and one outside, what have we seen that Rebbe Lazar says? Rebbe Lazar focuses on, did the final amount of burning that you did outside, would that have, if you had done it inside, would that have completed the process? And here, it would have completed the process, and therefore even Rebbe Lazar would agree that if you burn one inside and one outside, you would still be liable. Shnei beziche levona shehikriv echad mehem bachutz. Chayav, if you have two spoonfuls of lavona, which is what is necessary to bring with the lechem hapanim, so you're going to be liable if you bring both of them. Rabbi Lazar poter achi yakriv esasheni, and even if you bring one of them, if you bring one of them outside, the Tanakhama says you're going to be liable. And again, Rabbi Lazar, consistent with his philosophy, as we've seen over the last few days, Rabbi Lazar poter achi yakriv esasheni. No, you have to offer both of them. But again, if in fact you offered one of them inside, because the one that you're now offering on the outside, if you had offered it alone on the inside, it would have completed the process because you already offered the other one. Well, then when you offer it now on the outside, it's going to still complete the process, and you will be liable, even according to Rebbe Lazar. Okay, so boy, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka asked the question: Kometz mahu shiyatir kenegdo b'shirayim. If you just do the kometz, does that in and of itself permit part of what is left? Because of course you have to do both the kometz and the lavona in order to fully be able to eat the leftover mincha, right? The Kohanim can eat and benefit from the leftover mincha flour after you bring the kometz on the fire, put the kometz on the mizbeach, and you deal with the lavona. So on the mizbeach. So meishra shari o kalushe miklash. Now, do we say that when you only do one of them, namely you're doing the kometz, do we say that effectively is like it permits half of the mincha, it permits part of it, or do we say it just weakens the prohibition, meaning that now all you have to do is do the lavona piece? So aliba deman, who are you asking this question to? Aliba de Rebbe Meir, if you're asking it according to Rebbe Meir, to Amr Mefaglin B'chatzi Matir, who says that you can do pigul as long, even with something that permits just part of something, Mishrei Shari, he would certainly hold that it permits that this kometz alone would permit something, and therefore would make you liable if you did it outside the Beis Hamikdash. And therefore would say that, I'm sorry, not only would make you liable if you did it outside the Beis Hamikdash, but does actually permit some of the mincha offering. And Ialiba de Rabbanan, if you're saying about it, that according to the rabbis, de Amri ein mefaglin bechatzi matir, who say that no, when it comes to something where you need two things in order to do pigul, in order to make something permitted, you need to have in mind about all of it. Lo mishra shari v'lo miklash kalash. It's not going to even permit it. It's not going to weaken it. The same prohibition exists completely, and so as a result, there's not going to be any effect in that situation. And so as a result, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka has no need to ask the question. Ella aliba de Rebbe Lazar. So maybe he's asking according to Rebbe Lazar in our Mishnah, and but Rebbe Lazar Amar kirabanan sfirale. But Rebbe Lazar agrees with the rabbis that you need full pigul. You need to do pigul according for something that's going to permit completely in order to do pigul. And if you only focus on a single element that is a part of the element of permitting something, that's not going to trigger pigul. And so, therefore, again, according to them, according to Rebbe Lazar, there would be no weakening at all. So, Ella. So the Amr ain mefaglin bechatzi matter, because again, Rebbe Lazar says that you don't have a pigul with something that is just a partial permitter. You need to engage in the pigul thoughts associated with something completely that would fulfill the obligation completely. Ella aliba de rabbanan dahacha. So according to the rabbis here, namely our Tanakama, so Mishri Shari o Kalash Miklash. And the answer is Teku. We're not actually sure. Okay, so our next Mishnah, bottom of Kuf Yud Amud Aleph. Hazoruk miktas damim b'chutz. If you throw some of the blood outside the Beis Hamikdash, chayav, you're going to be liable. And here, take a look at the Rashi, top of Rashi on Kuf Yud Amud Bet. Chayav l'Rabbanan delo bo kulo matir. That according to the rabbis, it's clear that you're going to be chayav because you don't need the full thing in order to make it be mutter in the first place. You don't need to do the full amount. But Rabbi Lazar nami moda, and even Rabbi Lazar would agree, ba keda amrin b'Gemara, as we are going to see in the Gemara. And Rabbi Lazar adds, Av haminasech meachag b'chag chutz chayav. Similarly, one who offers the water outside the Beis Hamikdash or during the holiday of Sukkot is going to be liable. Rashi explains, shenis malu l'shem nisach hamayim. You filled a vessel in order to do a vessel of the Beis Hamikdash, in order to do the pouring of the water b'chag HaSukkot on Sukkot, and now you took it and you poured it outside. Rabbi Nechemia says back in our Mishnah, second line, Shiare hadam shekrivu b'chutz. If you have remnant blood. So again, remember, after you do the sprinkling of or spreading of the blood on the mizbeach, you have to pour the rest of the blood on the base of the altar. Now, according to Rabbi Nechemia, that pouring of the base of the rest of the blood is me'akev, and if you don't do it, you haven't fulfilled your obligation with respect to the korban. And so, as a result, for him, if you were to take that remnant blood, which is obligated to be put onto the base of the altar, and if you don't do it, it's ma'akev. Your korban's not going to be valid. So if you take that and you take it outside the Beis Hamikdash and you put it on a foreign altar, chayav, then you're going to be liable. Whereas everybody else would say you're not going to be liable because you don't. It's not even necessary. It's there's no requirement associated with it. All right.
Is it ma'akev even ba'onus?
Yes, I think it is. I think he says it's makiv. If you don't do it, for whatever reason, you're going to have to do
spills. It spills and doesn't.
Correct. And now everybody else says that you're fulfilled your obligation. It's just Rabbi Nechemia. Okay, Amarava umoda Rabbi Lazar b'damim. Rabbi Lazar agrees when it comes to the blood. D'Tanan, and this is it's actually a Mishnah, so we change it to D'Tanan. The Mishnah is in Maseches Yoma. Daf Samech Amud Aleph. Rabbi Lazar of Rabbi Shimon Omrim. Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon say Mimakom Shepasuk Hu Mastil. That both Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon agree that if the blood spills in the middle of your doing the offerings, you can pick up where you left off. And so as a result, that shows that just partial blood is fulfilling the obligation associated with whatever it is that you're doing. And so you can just pick up from that point. You slaughter a new animal if all the blood spilled, and you pick up from that point with the rest of the applications. Rabbi Lazar Omer, Av haminasech mei hachag b'chag b'chutz. And similarly, Rabbi Lazar says that if you poured some of the water outside, and now this is the topic that we talked about touched on yesterday. Rabbi Yochanan b'shum Rabbi Menachem Yodfa. Rabbi Lazar kishitas b'shitas Rabbi Akiva Rabo Amra. That actually maybe Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Menachem that in fact Rabbi Lazar is agreeing with Rabbi Akiva the Amr Nisuch Hamayim Deoraisa, because according to Rabbi Akiva, he says that it's biblical, that it's actually a biblical obligation. Unlike our drasha of the extra mem, yud, and mem in the korbanot on in Parshas Pinchas during Sukkot, where we have an extra mem, yud, mem. Here he says that it's actually a biblical requirement and not just a hinted to in the Torah. The Tanya, because we have a brisa that makes it explicit. Rabbi Akiva Omer unsacheha. It says in Parshas Pinchas Perek Kaftet Pasuk Lamed Aleph of Dvarim that it says libations plural b'shnei nesuchim hakasim medaber. It's got to be two libations. Echa nisach hamayim ve'echa nisach hayayin. Of course, the classic one is the wine, and we add to it the water. So Amar le Reish Lakish lo Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish says to Rabbi Yochanan, Imala halan shloshes lugin avkan shloshes lugin. Well, if you're going to say that we're learning one from the other, then you should need 3 lugin in order to fulfill the obligation and in order to fulfill the violation. And here it seems that any amount of water would be problematic. V'ha Rabbi Lazar meyachag ka'amar, and Rabbi Lazar says just water for Sukkot, which implies any amount of the water. So imala halan b'shar yemos hashana, and moreover, if Rabbi Lazar is talking about the rest of the year, Afkan b'shar yemos hashana. In fact, when it comes to libations, so maybe we need the water all year round if we're going to make the connection and have libations mean that. For Rabbi Lazar b'chag kamar, and Rabbi Lazar says that it's what we're talking about, meaning that the violation should be any point in the year. Meaning, if you take the water, if in fact the water is sanctified in a vessel, then in the base of Mikdash, and you take it outside, it should violate just like taking out the wine libations apply all year round. So, but yet Rabbi Lazar said that it applies only on Sukkot itself.
Well, does he want to say there's Rabbi, not Elazar, who's the other one? He wants this, not Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Leke,
Rabbi Yochanan was quoting Rabbi Menachem Yudfas.
Does he want to say that there's a chiyuv to take mamayim b'meshach hashana or not? Is that the implication?
No. He's not saying that he's a chiyuv. The question is now in our Mishnah, Rabbi Lazar is clearly saying that you're only liable for taking the water outside the Beis Hamikdash on Sukkot itself.
Right.
But if we're saying that Rabbi Lazar is agreeing with Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva says that unsacheha, that we have 2 libations, and we are thereby connecting the water libation to the wine libation on Sukkot. So I would say, just as if you were to take the wine libation from Sukkot and you wait until after Sukkot and then bring it outside, you would be liable. So too, if you took water from Sukkot and you brought it outside the Beis Hamikdash, you would be liable after Sukkot as well. But we don't say that. Rabbi Lazar says that you're only liable for taking the water out and pouring it outside on an altar outside the Beis Hamikdash on Sukkot itself. And so that's the question. The 2 questions are, either if you're going to learn one from the other, well, then you should need the full amount, 3 lugin, in order to violate the prohibition on taking water out, and the the prohibition should apply all year round if the water was sanctified. And Rebbe Lazar seems to have neither of those. So ishtamite had Amar Rebbe Asi. What clearly Rabbi Nachum of Yodfas forgot what Rabbi Asi said. To Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Mishum Rabbi Nechunya, Ish Bikas Beis Chortan. So it was all said in the name of Rabbi Nechunya. Eser Netios Arava B'Nisach Hamayim Halacha LaMoshe Misinai. That you have these various laws, the rule of the 10 saplings that's associated with what's considered a field, the willow ceremony on the taking a ravos on Sukkot in the Beit Hamikdash, and the libation of water on Sukkot. They are all halakha l'Moshe Misinai, meaning that it is not an explicit mitzvah min Torah, and therefore there is therefore there's going to be a we have a source other than Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Lazar is based on this source, and therefore Rabbi Lazar has the ability to say that we're not treating mayim like wine, and we're not treating with respect to the amount, and we're not treating mayim like wine with respect to when you would be liable, but rather this wine, because it's just a halacha l'moshe Sinai, just a halacha l'moshe Sinai, put in quotes, it is not subject to those same requirements, and we are not learning from wine to water, and therefore less water will constitute a prohibition, and the prohibition will only apply to water on Sukkot. So with that, we're now at Tana Rabbanan, and we will pick up fourth last to last line on Kuf Yud Amud Bet, and we will, God willing, pick up from there over Shabbos and Sunday. I believe the recording for Sunday is already, potentially even already on the website. Hopefully, it'll be on the website before Sunday, but that's going to be a recorded class from Rebelli, and then the Motzi Shabbos, they'll be meeting at the usual time, and we'll pick up, God willing, from Tana Rabbanan on Kuf Yud Amud Bet.
So that no one wants to
Steinsaltz
say.
has a note that Rambam Paskins like Rabbi Eliezer here.
Really interesting. Very interesting.
That's rare.
Yes, that's why I said that's why it's very interesting. 100%. Yishkach.
But no one would say that there's any chiyuv to bring water, or that the water would be sanctified during the year, right?
Correct. Nobody's saying that. The question is if you were to take that water outside the Beis Hamikdash and offer it not on Sukkot outside the Beis Hamikdash, if in fact we were to learn the water halachot the way Rabbi Akiva learns the water halachot, we should say that that would be also problematic. But Rebbe Lazar doesn't say that. And so that's why we need to come up with an alternative source for Rabbi Lazar, and that is that it's halacha l'moshe Sinai, and that is in some ways the basis of saying that there's the extra mem yud mem in the Chumash, and so because it says nisacheha, again, that's the same one that we had here, niskehem, and then there's another word that adds the extra mem as well, and the bottom line,
I think it's mishpatam.
Yes, exactly, that's right, mishpatam, the extra mem in mishpatam. Thank you very much for the reminder. 100%. And so that's it. So that is only a hint. It is not it's not considered sort of a biblical halacha, but rather it's just halacha l'moshe Sinai. Again, just in quotes, and therefore it doesn't have, because that drasha doesn't involve a comparison of the wine libations to the water libations. There's no basis to learn one from the other, and therefore it's going to have distinct rules, and that's why Rebbe Lazar could have you liable for lesser amounts, and how come you would only be liable if you do it on Sukkot.
But what
I've got more. There's a second Steinsaltz note that says that even though it's a halakha l'moshe Sinai, you're still liable for taking water outside.
Yes, exactly. Even though, and that's in fact, that's a halacha that Rebbe Lazar teaches in our Mishnah. So absolutely, 100%. Meaning, it still has a biblical element to it. It's important to understand halacha l'moshe Sinai is not derabanan. It's still a halakha, so it's got a significant part, and therefore, I mean, this could be, depending on how one understands halakha l'moshe Sinai, could be an example of where the rabbis have the ability, and the rabbis do have this ability in many instances, to define the scope of the biblical prohibition, And so here they're saying that in fact the biblical prohibition of bringing something outside would include the water as well.
This is unusual though, because normally you can't bring a chatat usually unless it's specifically required in the Torah, and this is an exception to that.
Well, remember that the chatas is specifically required in the Torah in connection with offering something outside. And so the question is what is the thing that's offered outside? And so and again, the rabbis use a number of of drashot methodologies, in order to
Yeah.
figure out what's covered, and they include this in what's covered. Now you're right, but at the same time it's important to understand that the fundamental prohibition is the one that's explicit in the Torah, and that we've got covered. All
Yeah.
right.
What's
And
the scenario
uh,
where Rabbi Akiva
Shabbat
would
Shalom, I gotta go.
require
Shabbat
a
shalom.
the the mayim inside the Beit HaMikdash?
I'm sorry. What's the
Well,
situation we're talking?
what's a scenario where we would even use the mayim inside the Beit
Well,
HaMikdash?
everybody agrees, whether it's Halakha L'Moshe Sinai or you learn it from the Drasha of Rabbi Akiva, that on Sukkot, not only do you do libations of wine, but we also do special libations of water.
Right,
That's
during Sukkot, but what about the rest
correct.
of the year?
No,
What
no,
does
no,
Rabbi
nobody's
Akiva?
saying that. Nobody's saying. The only question is if you were to do, according to Rabbi Akiva, based on his drasha, then you would also potentially say that if you offered water outside the Beis Hamikdash, you could still be liable during the rest of the year, because the whole lesson of how you learned the water in the first place was essentially a connection to wine, because it says unsacheha,
Right.
it's libations, and so as a result, those implies two libations. So we're going to connect the two together.
But is there a scenario where they're pouring water on the
No,
no,
only on Sukkot. Only on
only on
Sukkot.
Sukkot.
Only
So
on Sukkot.
I didn't even understand that. Where would be a hava meaning for him to suggest that during the year as well you could do?
Because wine has the prohibition all year round to
Uh-huh.
put it on the mizbeach outside. So I would also say
Uh-huh.
let's learn from wine, since we're connecting wine and
I
water
see.
together. So we're going to say that also water, if you bring it outside during the rest of the year, you're going to also be liable. That would be, again, only according to Rabbi Kiva, because he connects the two. For everybody else, that's why we have in our Mishnah, Rabbi Lazar says it's only on Chag.
So if someone were to walk on, it said there's an animal burning it, he decides I'm going to pour water on there. He's not just he hasn't done anything
You would not be
basically.
liable, correct.
Yeah, hasn't
And
done it.
again, Rashi makes clear that even according to Rabbi Akiva, at least the way I will read Rashi, that even according to Rabbi Akiva, you would still need to have you put that water in a kli shares in the Mesa Migdash, and say that it was sanctified, because nobody is saying that if you put a chulin, if you don't sanctify, for example, if you don't sanctify the animal before you put it on the altar outside, you've done nothing. You've
Nothing.
killed an animal. Maybe there's a violation of however you killed that animal. But the bottom line is you didn't do anything. You haven't. It's only when you have something sanctified that bringing it on the altar outside is going to be a problem. And so as a result, the water, in order to even potentially be a problem, has to have been sanctified by a klisha race in the first place. So
Uh-huh.
certainly, if you see somebody doing a foreign altar outside the Beis Hamikdash today, and you say, "Oh, I'm going to throw water on it,"
You haven't done anything.
you haven't. Yeah, you're doing the right thing, because you're trying to stop the burning of the
Oh,
animal
okay.
of the sacrifice. So
But you
100%.
certainly haven't done anything wrong.
Correct. Correct. Exactly. Exactly. Yeshikach, have a wonderful Shabbos. Looking forward to continuing our learning
Are you
together.
back next week or what's the story
I
next
am back in person, and Monday through Friday I will be teaching this coming week. Dove is still in Israel, and so I will be teaching in person, live, I believe, all week, Monday through Friday. So looking forward to continuing our learning together.